Want to know how to be way more aggressive and take less damage like one of the best players in World of Tanks? Well, today I'm going to showcase some brilliant examples of how you can do this and end up winning a ton more games. So to start off with, we're going to see an aggressive push from a tank that isn't usually necessarily one of the most aggressive tanks in the game, even if it is very fast, but is kind of a paper vehicle in the AMX-50B. Now, contrary to popular belief, the AMX-50B is actually a pretty good vehicle for when it comes to being aggressive and getting early damage, and early damage is obviously something that every single aggressive player wants to be able to get. And why exactly is that? Why is it so important for you to be able to pick up early damage game and to be aggressive at the beginning of the game? Why is it all this rage to be aggressive? Well, the whole point is that you can do things like this, and often in the later stages of the game you're not able to rip apart opponents for a ton of damage. You won't often find opponents doing silly mistakes because they've already done it, and if you're sat at the back of the map like the Leopard 1 for example in this game, not calling him out, but he's probably only got one or maybe two opportunities so far to do any damage, whereas being in where the AMX-50B is, he's got the opportunity to not only get multiple shots on lots of different opponents, but also make plays to impact the game and therefore get some damage. Now, unfortunately, in doing so, he does take one from the RU, but in taking that hit from the RU, he's able to find the Malshan and the Malshan side and the front lower plate in a good position for him to be able to rip apart the enemy team, break the flank and expose the enemy team to be able to be attacked by his team, securing a better chance of winning the game. I can guarantee if you stayed back where the Leopard 1 was, you would not have been able to actually get anywhere near the amount of damage, and you certainly wouldn't have been able to impact the flank like you've seen here and get anywhere near as much damage as you've been seeing. So it's a really nice position that you can take as a aggressive player on Airfield, and you know, you should always have multiple strategies in your arsenal, and this is a very valid one, predominantly based upon if you think that there are people in the bushes over here which could potentially shoot you as you try and go into the middle, but that's the risk that you take when playing aggressive, and you have to be very aware of what you're doing. This next replay is going to showcase a really textbook example of how to push on steps if you're playing in a heavy tank. Now, first things first, the i7 makes it to this corner. Really nice position at the beginning of the game to spot the cross like you're seeing straight dead ahead. Unfortunately, when you're playing in a heavy, you've got worse view range and it's harder to spot the opponents, but it still is a very valid point and of course can lead to free shots of damage. For example, when the Conway pushed out into the open, able to get a free shell of damage on him, and there was no way that the Conway was going to be able to fully aim and also get a accurate shot back at him, so very little chance of him being penned. And then you're seeing here, once again, textbook example of just staying here, waiting for your opponents to make the mistake at the beginning of the game, capitalizing and getting over 900 damage within the first few trades, and you literally didn't even have to lose any health at all. Now, next he sees the Type 61 fire and making sure that you're counting how many shells that the opponents are firing, or potentially if the opponents have actually fired in the first place. If they're not an autoloader, then you can make an aggressive push to be able to get a free shell of damage, be the first one shooting in the engagement, which gives you the DPM advantage. Even if you may not have the same DPM as someone else, if you get the first shell and they've having to wait, 6 seconds to reload their first one to get the first shell, it gives you that little boost at the beginning of a trade. The aggressive push here, obviously managing to spot both the Progetto and of course some of the opponents and being the frontal force of your team, although you don't necessarily always want to be the most forward vehicle in the game all of the time, and you certainly don't want to over push to the point where your teammates, for example the Progetto here, the Progetto and the other Progetto, it's like Progetto City over here, but if you overexpose yourself, if you were to come round this corner, you're not going to be able to essentially get any spotting or anything like that from your teammates, because they're not just going to be able to hit anything that you're fighting against. Now if you end up winning this flank, then you have two options when trying to make a further push into the enemy's base, and of course find the last remaining vehicles that may be on this flank. And it predominantly lies around the fact that you need to push up to this position here, or you push over to this corner here. Now if you go into the center area over here, you find it very difficult to be able to be supported, and although in World of Tanks you shouldn't always really rely on your team, in fact rely on your team at all, but what you should do is give your team the opportunity to help you out in a case where maybe you could potentially need it. And that is really what the top players will do, is that they won't necessarily always require their team or rely on them, but if they put themselves in a best position whereby, you know, if they get YOLO'd, they're going to get some team support or have your team be able to shoot them, it's going to be much better. And you won't have to lose as many hit points, if any, if they do make a silly play from the opponents. So of course, knowing that the enemy teams are on the other side of the map, it's time to push once again and make the forward frontal assault, and it's at the end of the game where you can start getting a ton more damage if you do play it correctly and if you survive long enough, which means that often you don't want to be too aggressive in the beginning. So you have to be just very fluid with how you progress, and often the passive aggressive approach is the best way of playing World of Tanks, whereby you get into a position, you hold that position really well, and then from there you make the necessary trades possible to progress the flank that you're on, or even potentially go back to defend the base if needs be, and it's not going to be a detriment to your game or the team. And of course that's going to help both your damage, your assistance, and also the ability for you to win games and get that win rate up. Now it wouldn't be an aggressive gameplay video if we didn't showcase the Object 268 version 4. And what's always funny about this vehicle is that it has the armour of a heavy tank, but also the mobility of something that you'd expect from a medium to a degree, and that's what makes this thing really special for pushing aggressively. And if you play it more passively, often you'll end up just having worse games, because it relies upon the fact that it is up close and personal with the opponents. And the reason this gameplay is so important is because it showcases what happens when your team start ruffle stomping. And obviously you can be aggressive in a pretty passive game, and it's obviously going to come out quite well, but what happens when you find yourself in a situation where you have to move forward? Often in games where you're feeling like your team are just going to run through the opponents, you end up with not very much damage because you haven't had the opportunity to do so. And so being aggressive in these types of games like this one is crucial in how you can come away with the top damage in the game as opposed to one of your teammates. Now granted, in a tank like this that's a lot faster, it is of course a lot easier to get forward and be the first one forward in your games, and that is really what we have to say when we do talk about the Object 268 version 4. Now you can see that the enemy team are starting to dwindle down, and when you're in this sort of position you've really just got to go, and instead of trying to get one tiny little shot off on the TNH, he actually just goes for that tiny little ram for a little bit of damage and then pushes on forward. Now this push is the difference between someone who may get 5,000 damage and someone that may end up with 7,000, 8,000, 9,000, and it's because, you know, you don't delay in those moments where you need to be decisive and you have to push forward to get extra damage. And you're seeing here going in to try and reset the cap, finishing off the waffle. Now the game is theirs to lose, and of course when you find yourself up against a standard B, the only common thing to do in an Object 268 version 4 is to YOLO in and of course ram him for 1,000 damage. Now I'm not going to sugarcoat it, this is a pretty lucky opportunity, you know, this isn't going to happen every game, but what I'm trying to say is that in games where you have to push and you have to be aggressive, you've got to take the chance to go in and try and get that extra damage by being the forefront if possible. Even if you've had a bad game, what you can do is you can recoup it at the last moments in something like a game like this, where maybe you're up against a 15-0 game where your team have just completely whitewashed the enemy team, and of course if you do this and you're pushing and you're first one forward, you're going to more likely be able to get spotting damage, and you never know, you may even end up ammo racking a Skoda T50, which is perfectly balanced, of course, as all things should be. Now I think we've covered some really good bases on, of course, being aggressive, and hopefully you guys have enjoyed, and if you have, please do think about subscribing, but more importantly go and check out how to boost your spotting damage within World of Tanks, and if you go and check out that video that's on screen right now, I may even give you a free 1000 damage from a bot in the next game.